gums at each other any chance they get. The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo. One of the greatest knockouts you'll ever see! It's time!
For you to sit back, relax, and listen to a complete and fucking utter armchair expert give his completely and utterly useless opinions on the one hell of an amazing sport that is MMA.
G'day, guys. Of course, I wait until the week of the biggest card I've ever seen, the most historic, that's for sure, to get sick. So if I'm actually recording this during the day for the first time ever to make sure that my nose ain't too clogged up, and thus meaning my voice isn't too muffled. But if you hear me cough or blow my nose a little, I do apologise, and you know why. But yes, we are going to get to UFC 300, but this is going to be an action-packed podcast indeed, and there's a couple of other things I want to talk about first. First off, as always, the UFC 299 recap, and what a main card it was indeed. Sorry, I'm just scratching my head above my headphones. What a action-packed card UFC 299 was indeed. Nearly had 20,000 people there, had $14 million at the gate at the Casaya Center in Miami, Florida. Peter Yan got back in the win column. Our boy Jack Della, who could be on an upcoming card that I'll talk about in a minute, had a win. MVP won in his debut against Kevin Holland. Dustin the Diamond Poirier got the dub against Benoit Saint Denis, and Sugar Sean O'Malley retained his bantamweight strap against Cheeto Vera, ladies and gentlemen. I should have said Jack Della won against Gilbert Burns, so we don't know where he's off to, but sorry. Yes, it was a action-packed card indeed, very much so, and I very much did enjoy it. Predicted all of the main card fights right, so I was very happy about that. But a couple other things I want to talk about before we get to UFC 300. It was announced the other week by the UFC that they are coming back to the land down under. UFC 305 in, I think, August, it said it was. I'm pretty sure it said August 18th or something like that. We'll be coming back to Perth at the RAC Arena, the same place UFC 284 was held in. Definitely keen for that. You would think guys like Jack Della, like I mentioned before, are going to be on it, and all the Aussie guys, maybe even Robert Whittaker, who knows, could possibly be on it. But it's led to a couple of questions about our Aussie guys, or at least the guys who fought in Australia, because one of them is an Aussie. There's a lot of talk that UFC 305 is going to be main evented by Izzy versus DDP for the middleweight strap. I don't mind that fight at all. Of course, they had some bad blood dating back to UFC 290 when Izzy got in the cage after his win against Robert Whittaker. I don't mind that fight at all. That grudge needs to be settled. The only thing that is a bone of contention with me is the fact that it means Strickland doesn't get an immediate rematch, which part of me says I kind of expect, because the UFC is very much about money fights these days, and Strickland didn't have the greatest record before defending his belt only once and losing it. But it was a very close fight that Strickland won on one card, and I think he deserves an immediate rematch, but that's just me. He seems resigned to the point that he won't get it because he's tweeting about fighting Paulo Costa now. Who knows? Maybe they make that a number one contender fight to Izzy versus DDP, even though that hasn't been announced yet. But if it is announced, there's a lot of talk that it will be on UFC 305. So the second time in a year that Izzy will be fighting in Australia, possibly, and I'm very keen for that possibly happening. Probably not going to get to go once again, unfortunately, because accommodation and flights and everything else over there just so out of my price range, but I'll definitely be looking forward to watching it indeed. Which brings me to Volk. Look, this is a hard topic, and to this day I find it hard listening to Land Down Under, or Down Under, I think it just is, because it just brings back so many memories. Obviously, I spoke about him losing, but what's his future? And also, let's look back at the past a bit. I forgot to say this in the last podcast, and I talked about it but I said it in a tweet after the fight, after UFC 298, that, and Volk got knocked out, which Volk got knocked out on, that in retrospect, him taking that second fight with Islam at UFC 294 in Abu Dhabi on such short notice, I think it was 11 days notice, and we all commended him for it at the time, but in retrospect, I think it was a mistake, because as we know, Volk got dropped in round one, and was his chin cracked? I don't know, but I said it, and a lot of other people appear to agree with it, so who knows? Does Volk get... I certainly hope Volk ain't on 305. Sorry. I certainly hope Volk ain't on 305, because that would be too soon in my view. He needs to take at least 6 months to a year off with no head strikes at all before he even thinks about coming back. But I think he probably gets the rematch, and then we'll see what happens, man. That probably determines whether or not his chin has been cracked. But yeah, I don't know where to next for him. I don't know. Other than that, I guess we'll just have to see what happens. I've got written here as well Izzy's future, but I kind of talked about that. There's a lot of talk that he'll fight on 305. Like I've said in other podcasts, I don't know what my thoughts on Izzy are now. Part of me wants to love him because of his his championship reign and all the stuff he's done and said and all that, and he's building investment properties for people to live in now. I've seen before, but sorry, yeah, just the way he acted in that 293 press conference, and looking back now, I may have already said this, I can't remember, but looking back now, Izzy was not his normal self in that presser. Like, he was very much distant and aloof and not talking much, and you could tell that something was off. Probably my best guess is Strickland got under his skin, but who knows? But him telling Strickland, like I said, I've already said this, but him, the man who raw dogged his opponent, who lay down on the ground in front of Alex Pereira's son. By the way, he raw dogged Costa, in case you guys forgot, at UFC 253. But yeah, the man who did all that is then now crying wolf about someone talking shit. Like, I don't know, man, that rubbed me up the wrong way a bit. So I don't know what his future with me is, but look, we'll see what happens. Does he get back to the top, or does he fight his way out and then maybe retire early? Clearly he's rich. He's got enough money to invest in houses, and he's investing it wisely, which is good. But I don't know what the future for Izzy is. I mean, he's been a dominant fighter for Australia and New Zealand, and a lot of people have. Well, some people haven't got behind him, but a lot of people have. So I'll always respect him for that, but I don't know, man. I just could not get behind what he said to Strickland after that fight at all. But anyway, guys, that was a long segment, and when I'll take a little break after this because my neck's getting a bit cranked up, and when we come back, UFC 300 and a hell of a lot more to come. All that and more when I come back. I just realised listening back to that, how the hell would a Costa versus Strickland fight for the number one contender make sense given Costa just lost to Whittaker? I don't know how that would make sense. But anyway, UFC 300 is here. It is literally a matter of days away. That is just so mental for me to say. Like I've said it a number of times on here. I watched years ago with my dad and his friend who's now passed away, rest in peace. Watched DC Stipe, was going to watch Conor Khabib, but didn't, sadly. Watched McGregor Mayweather, watched you name it. I was a fan back then. But I got out of it a little bit until me and my mate Jesse, who I've obviously had on this podcast, started watching at UFC 246, McGregor versus Cowboy, and now here we are. All these years, four and a bit years later, and now we're up to UFC 300, and we're still watching. We're going to be watching it this Sunday. Far out, dude. That is so crazy to me. So let's get into it, I guess. Let's get into reviewing UFC 300. Let's go to, as we always do, the UFC website, which is now no longer TBD versus TBD, which is good. As always, we're only reviewing the main card, because if I do watch the prelims, I don't ever talk about it. But main card. Ooh. Tell you what, though, there is a couple of fights worth mentioning on the prelims. And even the early prelim. Oh, and even the early prelims. Okay, so that's how stacked this card is. So, Devison Figueiredo is opening up UFC 300 against Cody Garbrandt, which is crazy. A lot of fighters clearly wanted to be on this. Bobby Green, who beat Tony Ferguson, is fighting Jim Miller, who I think is retiring on this card, I think I heard. Jessica Andrade is on the card. Let's see. Kayla Harrison makes her MMA debut against Holly Holm, who's ranked number 5 in the bantamweight women's division. Aljo's on it, ranked 2 in the featherweight division. He's fighting Calvin Kattar for the first time, I believe, since losing his belt at UFC 292 last year. And then Jiří Procházka, the former light heavyweight champion, closes out the prelims in a light heavyweight bout, ranked number 2, that is, Jiří Procházka, against Alexander Rakic. But now we get to the main card, ladies and gentlemen. Bo Nickel versus Cody Brundage in a middleweight bout. They're saying that Bo Nickel's going to win. Charles, the real champ, Oliveira versus Arman Chakazia, I don't even know how to pronounce that, in a lightweight bout. They're saying the other guy's going to win. Oh, by the way, sorry. Charles rank 1. The other guy's rank 4. Now we get to the business end of things, ladies and gentlemen. In a lightweight bout, making his lightweight debut, Max Blessed Holloway fights Justin the Highlight Gaethje for the title of baddest motherfucker on the planet. Keen as mustard for that. Oh, so now Max and Volk have both gone up to lightweight. I'll bet there's a part of Max that regrets that now, by the way, given Volk has lost. I do wonder what will happen after this fight, because they're saying that Justin's going to win, obviously. But I am keen as mustard for that fight. Moving on to the co-main event of the evening. One of our favourites in Zhang Weili defends her women's strawweight title against Yan... I don't even know how to pronounce her last name, but a fellow Chinese woman. Oh, God. We're renowned for that on this podcast. We can't pronounce names. I've probably offended a lot of people who've listened, but as always, we know Zhang Weili is one of our favourite fighters. Single-handedly saved UFC 248 from the disaster that was Izzy versus Romero, as I've often said. Deserved fight of the year, absolutely. And then she came back in front of her own people, I believe it was, and won the belt back again, I think. It was either that or another. I forget which card she won the belt back on. Let's actually see. Let's look that up. Slight delay. Let's check her record to see when she won the title back. Hold on. Okay, that's the next fight. Okay, it wasn't the one again. It wasn't the... Sorry, that wasn't even her own people. That was a Singapore card. Okay, so it was the card after the one I was talking about. She won the belt back against Carla Esparza. That's right. After that snooze... so she won the... Wow, so she's been on two historic cards. Well, not historic cards, because UFC 248 was only historic for the Zhang Weili fight, but she's been on two big cards in Izzy's life. So she obviously was on UFC 248, and then she won the belt back against Carla Esparza after that snooze fest she had with Thug Rose at UFC 281 Adesanya versus Pereira, which of course is when Izzy lost his belt for the first time at Madison Square Garden, I believe it was. And then her last fight was on that card that I just talked about before, that Aljo lost his belt on, UFC 292. And now she's fighting again this weekend, obviously, UFC 300. So very keen for that. But now, ladies and gentlemen, we get to the main event of the evening. Alex Poatan Pereira defending his light heavyweight title against number one ranked and former light heavyweight champion Jamahal Hill. They're saying Alex is going to win. Look, I don't know. Jamahal's not one to be messed around with. A lot of people are saying don't sleep on him. But the power of Poatan is one like no other. So very much so looking forward to that. But that's UFC 300, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people have hated on it because, like I've said before, it didn't really follow the tradition, I guess, of being star-studded. And yeah, it didn't to a degree. You know, they could have tried to get Conor, at least. That's what I'd hoped. But nonetheless, who we'll talk about later, Conor. But nonetheless, it is still stacked in its own way, as we've just seen. And I am indeed very keen for it. Going to be watching at a pub in an old favourite of mine, Sunbury. And probably getting the poster, because obviously a historic event like this, I need to get the poster for it. Definitely the most historic UFC card I've watched, certainly since UFC 246 anyway. Man, I still can't believe it's been so long. 4 years. Far out. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, going to take a quick break once again. And when I come back, a whole lot more to come. Okay, so again, listening back to that, I realised a couple of things. Number one, Kayla Harrison is not making her MMA debut. She's making her UFC debut. It's two very different things. if she was making her MMA debut in the UFC, well, she'd want to be pretty good. But number 2, I of course forgot to mention, and how could I forget, Jones versus DC, and talking about all those rivalries that I watched with my dad and his mate. Touchwood, rest in peace. But also, I thought back, I listened to that bit where I was talking about how nostalgic this all is for me, and I sort of thought about it. I was like, man, what an introduction to MMA that is for me and my friend. Like, watching Conor McGregor. That was the first fight we ever watched together. Like, really, honestly and truly. Like, even though Conor was past his best and blah, 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 it was still Conor McGregor. Like, and it was pre-leg break Conor McGregor, which, by the way, me and Jesse also watched live. What a scene that was. But, yeah, what an introduction to MMA that was, honestly. Like, wow. And I'm still so blown away by the fact that it's been so long. But we're going to get into the other topics of this podcast because there's a few I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about boxing very briefly. I mentioned towards the end of the last podcast that Francis Ngannou was going to be fighting Anthony Joshua. He did, and he lost spectacularly. He was knocked out. But he still deserves respect, in my opinion. Went out on a limb, gave away surefire money to fight John Jones, to bet on himself, and to make a statement in the process and, make himself a star, really, and got in there with, and not to mention make himself a lot of money, and he got in there with two of boxing's greatest heavyweights today, really, and fared pretty well against the world champ. That will never be forgotten, in my opinion. Arguably worried in a lot of people's eyes, arguably beat Tyson Fury, and then was not afraid to get in there with the other one. And showed respect to him afterwards. Like, how can you not give respect to that kind of person? Like, hands of steel and balls of steel and respect and integrity, and yeah, I'll always be Team Francis, man. Second thing I want to talk about very briefly before I get on to the final topics of this podcast is that Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson. Don't want to talk too much about it, but because I talked about it on the last podcast, but it is apparently going to be an exhibition, which you kind of expected, given it's Mike Tyson. Like, what? Sorry. Yeah, you kind of expected that, given it's Mike Tyson. What commission would, especially the one in Texas, would sanction that? But it's just funny, given the fact that Jake Paul has shat so much on the idea of exhibitions, and now he's going to be doing one. It's just quite funny, and I'll bet KSI, his arch nemesis, had a good laugh at that. Now we get to one of the biggest topics of this podcast, because I mentioned UFC 246. Conor McGregor. We've covered him extensively over the last couple of episodes, so I'm not going to go into everything that happened, but he did an interview with, I forget the guy's name, and I forget even the YouTube channel. I just remember, the one thing I remember was that Conor was actually wearing TNs. Never in my life did I ever think I would see Conor McGregor wearing TNs, but he more or less expressed his frustrations with how long things have taken, and he announced, or revealed, that there's 2 fights left on his contract. In my view, you don't do that unless you want out. And it's clear that the relationship, as I've talked about before, True Geordie, I've talked about what he said about it. It's clear now that the relationship between Conor and the UFC is not great. They're stalling him, you would think, for whatever reason, probably because they know he wants to go make boxing money and they don't want him to do that by himself. So they want to stall him until either he's completely worthless or not worth anywhere near as much, or until he signs a new deal. So, look, I'll go on record as saying, like, the UFC owe all of what they have now, really, to Conor McGregor. Like, that whole run he had paved the way for the expansion that they went through. And to me, the least they could do for him is just letting him fight out his contract and go make another big boxing payday and ride off into the sunset. But anyway, it was revealed by Conor, so take it as you will, after that interview that the UFC got in touch and said he'll be fighting in the summer, which, okay, that's good. We could possibly be getting Conor back. Would have been good to have him back on UFC 300. Would have been good to, to have him to be able to, take advantage of a star-studded card. But anyway, we could be getting him back. Actually, before I get to the next thing I'm going to say, one other thing he said in that interview that I found interesting was when he was asked why he didn't sign, or why he hasn't signed another deal yet, he said, I'm sure Lorenzo, that is Lorenzo Fertitta, one of the former owners of the UFC, would have had something juicy on the table by about now. So that's interesting. That all but confirms that Conor ain't really satisfied with the way things are being run there right now. But anyway, I digress. Like I said, to get back to what I was talking about, the UFC called him after that interview, apparently, and said that he'll be fighting in the summer. So, all good. Would have been good if we had Conor back early, but we could potentially be getting him back. All good. That is until a interview with him, and Jake Gyllenhaal comes out after that interview, promoting the new movie, the new movie they're both in together, Roadhouse. And he is very clearly off his dial. He can hardly string a sentence together. It's not good at all. And Jake Gyllenhaal is carrying most of the interview. And unless it was pre-recorded, you just look at it and go, gee, Conor's meant to be coming back to fighting? Like, I get he said, he keeps getting given a date and then not given a date and then he gets frustrated. That's fair enough, but it's like, man, how can you be fighting or preparing to fight and yet still ever so clearly on that stuff? Like, man, should he honestly be even fighting? It begs the question. I don't know, honestly. I don't know. But last two topics of the podcast. Ronda Rousey released her book recently, and obviously her fall was well documented. She got head kick KO'd in front of my hometown of Melbourne by Holly Holm, and then Amanda Nunes buried and cremated her, I think, over a year later, and she never fought again. And then she went to the WWE, and now it's been well documented that she had she doesn't have nice things to say about them either, and she aired all those grievances out in this book. And it's like, you absolutely are one of the founding fathers of women's MMA. You changed Dana White, who was on the record as saying that women will never fight in the UFC. You changed Dana White's mind, and you are owed credit for that, because if it wasn't for that, there's every chance we would never have seen Amanda Nunes, Zhang Weili, Holly Holm, all the great women fighters. You are owed a great debt of gratitude for that. But man, it's hard to get behind you when you show your true colours like this. It just is, and it's sad, but we're going to end this podcast off talking about the Second City Saint, 0-2, CM Punk. Because we did a podcast about his time in the UFC, and obviously since then he has returned to the WWE and has been doing pretty well there. But obviously, as I talked about, I believe, he had a pretty nasty exit with AEW, and he did an interview. Sorry. Not a good time to be blowing my nose while talking about Conor McGregor being on stuff, but he CM Punk did an interview with Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour, and he revealed basically all of what happened in the lead up to his AEW exit. I'm not going to delve into that because it's not what this show is about. But how does that company respond? By vindicating CM Punk and releasing the footage from his last day at the company when he got into a scuffle with Jack Perry, more or less validating everything he says. Well, look, like I said, I'm not going to get into my opinion too much on that because I do have an opinion, but it's not for this podcast. But thank God the WWE and the UFC are ran much, much better than that. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, this is an action-packed podcast indeed. Only fitting for UFC 300. And as always, I hope you guys enjoy it from wherever you end up watching it. Like I said, I'll be watching it at a pub. Absolutely a historic card, even though it's not as star-studded as we'd hoped. Absolutely a historic card for me, certainly. And once in a lifetime, man. I absolutely couldn't miss it. And I couldn't miss, even though I'm sick, doing a podcast about it. Wow, man. I'm still so floored by the fact that it's been so long. Feels like yesterday we were watching our first MMA fight, me and Jesse, and now we're at UFC 300. Gee whiz. But anyway, guys, enjoy this card because it only happens once every few years. And as always, till the next one, UFC 301, which I forgot to talk about. God, I forgot to talk about. I completely forgot to talk about Jose Aldo coming back. Gee whiz, I just remembered the Rio de Janeiro card. Jose Aldo is coming back in front of his own people. Wow. But we'll talk about that in the next podcast. Anyway, there was a lot to talk about. I couldn't think about everything when I wrote down the script for this podcast, and it ends up being a bit of a shit show. But anyway, guys, as always, enjoy UFC 300 because it only happens once every 5+ years. And till the next one, UFC 301, catches.